When Robert's grandmother passed away, he inherited something precious, 50 acres of beautiful farmland in rural Virginia that had been in his family since his great-grandfather bought it back in 1952. The land had everything you could dream of, rolling hills covered in wildflowers every spring, a gentle creek that ran crystal clear through the property, and the old white farmhouse where Robert had spent the best summers of his childhood, catching fireflies and learning to fish from his grandma. Robert lived 3 states away in Ohio, working as a high school teacher. After the funeral, there was so much to handle: paperwork, estate lawyers, phone calls with his aunt and uncle about dividing up Grandma's belongings. 6 months passed in a blur of grief and legal procedures before he could finally make the trip down to Virginia to see the property. He drove down on a Friday afternoon in early October. The leaves were just starting to turn, and Robert felt a mix of sadness and nostalgia as he turned onto the old county road. But as he got closer to the property, something felt wrong. There was dust in the air. He could hear machinery rumbling in the distance, then he saw it. His heart dropped into his stomach. Where there should have been open fields in his grandmother's old farmhouse, there were construction crews everywhere. Heavy machinery rolled across the land. Concrete trucks lined the dirt access road. And houses, dozens and dozens of houses in various stages of construction. Some were just concrete foundations. Others had frames going up. A few looked almost finished. Robert slammed on his brakes and jumped out of his truck. A construction worker looked up from his clipboard, clearly surprised to see someone running toward him looking so upset. "What the hell is going on here?" Robert demanded. "This is my land. My property. Who authorized this?" The foreman, a heavy-set man in a yellow hard hat, looked confused. He pulled out some papers from his truck and showed them to Robert. "Sir, we have all the proper permits. This project was approved by Pinnacle Development Corporation. They own this land. We've been working here for 4 months now." Robert felt like the ground was spinning beneath his feet. "That's impossible. My grandmother owned this land. She died 6 months ago and left it to me. I never sold anything to anyone." The foreman looked uncomfortable now. He showed Robert more documents. Sales agreements, building permits, county approvals. All of it stamped and official looking. And there on the sale documents was what appeared to be his grandmother's signature, dated just 3 weeks before she died. But Robert knew something was terribly wrong. 3 weeks before his grandmother passed, she was in the hospital, barely conscious. She had been battling cancer for months and could hardly hold a pen, let alone negotiate a land sale. Someone had forged her signature. Robert immediately called a lawyer. Then another. Finally, he found someone willing to take the case on a weekend. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, reviewed the documents Robert had photographed. Her face grew grim. "This is fraud," she said bluntly. "But proving it and stopping this construction is going to be complicated." These developers clearly moved fast, hoping no one would notice until it was too late. That Monday morning, Patricia filed an emergency injunction to halt all construction. They presented evidence that Robert's grandmother was hospitalized and incapacitated when the sale documents were supposedly signed. They had medical records. They had testimony from nurses and doctors. It seemed like a clear-cut case. But Pinnacle Development Corporation wasn't some small-time operation. They had a team of expensive lawyers who showed up to court in suits that probably cost more than Robert made in a month. Their argument was calculated and cold. Yes, perhaps there were irregularities in the initial sale. That could be investigated. But Pinnacle had already invested over $8 million in this development. They had contracts with home builders, agreements with future buyers, and 75 families counting on these houses. Stopping construction now would cause irreparable financial harm. The judge looked tired. He looked at Robert, then at the Pinnacle lawyers, then at the pile of paperwork on his desk. He made a decision that felt like a punch to Robert's gut. Construction could continue while the case moved through the courts. A full hearing would be scheduled to determine the validity of the sale and the ownership of the land. That hearing was set for 8 months away. Robert stood outside the courthouse, watching the Pinnacle lawyers load into their luxury cars and drive away. Patricia put a hand on his shoulder. "We're not done fighting," she said. "But you need to prepare yourself. This is going to be a long battle, and it's going to be expensive." Over the next few months, Robert's life became a nightmare. He drove down to Virginia every few weeks, each time watching more of his family's land disappear under suburban sprawl. The construction crews worked fast, too fast. Houses went up at a pace that seemed almost frantic, as if Pinnacle knew they were racing against legal consequences. Robert noticed things that bothered him beyond just the stolen land. The houses were crammed together on lots that seemed way too small. There was barely 15 feet between some of them. The mature oak and maple trees his great-grandfather had planted were all cut down. The gentle slope of the land had been graded flat with bulldozers. The creek looked different, too, muddy and constrained by new drainage pipes. He took photos, documented everything, met with Patricia every week to go over the case. The legal fees started piling up. $5,000, then $10,000, then $20,000. Robert took out a loan against his house in Ohio. He maxed out credit cards. He picked up summer school teaching jobs and tutored on weekends to cover the costs. Patricia's investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. The county had granted Pinnacle special variances to allow this dense construction. Normal zoning laws in that area required minimum lot sizes of half an acre. Pinnacle got approval to build on lots as small as 1/10 of an acre. The variances had been granted in closed-door meetings. Robert had never been notified, never invited to voice concerns, never even told the meetings were happening. When Patricia dug deeper, she found that 3 county board members had financial connections to Pinnacle's parent company. One board member's son worked for Pinnacle. Another had received campaign donations. The third owned stock in the parent corporation. It was corruption. Clear and simple, but proving it in court was another matter entirely. Pinnacle's lawyers filed motion after motion, requesting delays, demanding additional depositions, challenging every piece of evidence. It was obvious they were trying to drag the case out, bleeding Robert dry financially and emotionally. By the spring, families were moving into the first completed houses. Young couples, retirees, families with kids. They had no idea they were living on stolen land. No idea about the legal battle raging around them. They just saw affordable new houses in what the advertisements called Meadowbrook Estates. They were innocent people starting new lives, which made Robert's situation even more complicated. Robert lay awake at night, staring at his ceiling, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. His grandmother's land, the place of his happiest memories, was being turned into a neighborhood he didn't recognize, and there seemed to be nothing he could do to stop it. By summer, the development was nearly complete. Robert drove past his family's property and barely recognized it anymore. 75 houses now stood where his grandmother's farmhouse used to be. Cookie-cutter homes in beige and gray, each one looking almost exactly like the next. Tiny front yards, narrow driveways, the kind of dense suburban sprawl you'd see outside any American city. The legal battle had become Robert's second full-time job. When he wasn't teaching, he was on the phone with Patricia, reviewing documents or driving down to Virginia for depositions. Pinnacle's lawyers had turned the case into a war of attrition. Every week brought new paperwork, new demands, new delays. They wanted Robert's financial records going back 10 years. They wanted interviews with every family member who might have known about the land. They wanted documentation of every conversation Robert ever had with his grandmother about inheritance. It was invasive and exhausting, and Robert knew exactly what they were doing. They were betting he'd run out of money and energy before they did. The legal fees had climbed past $60,000. Robert had burned through his savings, borrowed against his retirement account. His wife was understanding but worried. They had 2 kids in middle school, and the college funds were looking smaller every month. "Maybe we should settle," she said one night over dinner. "Take whatever they're offering and move on with our lives." Robert wanted to. God, how he wanted to just let it go. But every time he thought about giving up, he pictured his grandmother. The way she'd walk him through the fields, pointing out different wildflowers. The way she'd taught him to read the weather by watching the clouds. This land was her legacy, and he couldn't just hand it over to people who'd stolen it through fraud. Patricia uncovered more evidence of corruption. The county board meetings where Pinnacle got their special variances had happened on unusual dates. 2 were held during holiday weeks when public attendance was minimal. Meeting minutes were sparse and vague. Public comment periods that were legally required had been suspiciously short or skipped entirely. One county board member, William Hutchins, had been particularly aggressive in pushing through Pinnacle's permits. Patricia found that Hutchins owned a consulting company that had received $200,000 from Pinnacle's parent corporation the year before. It was paid for advisory services, though no one could explain what those services were. Robert and Patricia tried to get the press interested. They contacted local newspapers and television stations. A few ran small stories, but nothing gained much traction. Pinnacle had good relationships with local media. They bought advertising. They sponsored community events. One newspaper editor told Robert off the record that his publisher didn't want to rock the boat. The hearing date kept getting pushed back. First it was moved to December, then February, then April of the following year. Each delay meant more legal fees for Robert and more time for Pinnacle to establish the development as a done deal. Meanwhile, Robert started hearing from the families who'd bought houses in what was now officially called Meadowbrook Estates. Some had found his contact information through the court records. They were scared and angry. A young couple named the Rodriguezes reached out. They'd bought one of the houses for what seemed like a great price. It was their first home, but now they were hearing rumors about legal problems with the land. Their mortgage company was getting nervous. The title insurance company had sent them a letter asking questions they couldn't answer. "We didn't know," Mrs. Rodriguez told Robert over the phone, her voice breaking. "We have a baby. We put everything we had into this house. Are you saying we might lose it?" Robert felt sick. These families were victims too. They'd trusted Pinnacle, trusted the county officials who'd approved the development, trusted that everything was legal and above board. Now they were caught in the middle of a mess they didn't create. He tried to explain that his fight was with Pinnacle, not with the families, but he couldn't promise them everything would be okay, because honestly, he had no idea how this would end. As Robert spent more time around the property, he started noticing other problems beyond just the legal issues. The land itself looked wrong. His grandmother's property had been carefully managed for decades. Natural drainage patterns, mature trees that prevented erosion, wildlife corridors. Now all of that was gone. The creek worried him most. It had always been a gentle, clear stream. Now it ran brown and swollen after every rain. The banks were eroding. Pinnacle had straightened sections of it and put in concrete culverts. They'd cleared all the vegetation along the banks. The water moved faster now, angrier. Robert wasn't an engineer, but he'd grown up playing in that creek. He knew how it behaved in different seasons, how it swelled in spring but never flooded, how it dried to a trickle in late summer but never completely disappeared. The creek had been there for thousands of years, cutting its own path through the landscape. Now it looked like something that might jump its banks at any moment. He contacted an environmental engineer named Dr. Helen Brooks. She agreed to come out and assess the property. What she found alarmed her. "This entire development is built in a floodplain," she explained to Robert as they walked the property. "See how the land naturally slopes toward this depression? Water wants to flow here during heavy rain, but now you've got houses sitting right in the middle of it." She pointed to the grading work Pinnacle had done. They'd flattened everything, destroying the natural contours that had channeled water safely for generations. They'd also created huge amounts of impervious surface, roofs, driveways, roads, sidewalks. All that meant rainwater couldn't soak into the ground anymore. It would run off, and it would run off fast. "What about the drainage system?" Robert asked. "They put in all those storm drains and pipes." Dr. Brooks shook her head. "Those are sized for normal rainfall events. Maybe they can handle the water from a typical summer thunderstorm. But a big storm? A hurricane? This system would be overwhelmed in minutes. You'd see catastrophic flooding." Robert's stomach turned. "What happens in catastrophic flooding?" "Best case scenario, property damage. Worst case, people could die." Robert demanded a meeting with the county board. He brought Dr. Brooks and her report. They presented the findings, explaining the flood risk in terms anyone could understand. The houses were in danger. The families living there were in danger. This development should never have been approved. William Hutchins barely looked at the report. "Mr. Patterson, I understand you're upset about your legal situation, but we're not going to entertain these scare tactics." This property was thoroughly evaluated before permits were issued. Multiple engineers signed off on it. "Can I see those engineering reports?" Robert asked. "They're part of the administrative record." "You can file a public records request." Robert did file the request. It took 6 weeks to get a response. When the documents finally arrived, Robert and Patricia pored over them. The engineering reports were thin, superficial. They covered the minimum requirements and nothing more. No real analysis of flood risk. No watershed studies. No consideration of downstream impacts. Patricia found something interesting. The engineering firm that signed off on Pinnacle's plans had done 13 other projects for Pinnacle in the past 3 years. They'd been paid over $2 million. It wasn't illegal, but it raised questions about whether the engineers were really independent reviewers or just rubber stamping whatever their client wanted. Robert tried to warn the residents of Meadowbrook Estates. He created a website, posted information on social media, even tried to organize a community meeting. But Pinnacle's lawyers threatened him with a harassment lawsuit. The Homeowners Association, which was controlled by Pinnacle until enough houses sold, sent a cease and desist letter. Most of the residents didn't want to hear it anyway. They'd just bought their dream homes. They'd invested their life savings. The idea that they were living in a dangerous flood zone was too terrifying to accept. It was easier to believe Robert was just a troublemaker trying to tank their property values. By the fall, Robert was exhausted. The hearing was finally scheduled for November. Patricia had built what she believed was a strong case: the forged signature, the corruption in the county approval process, the inadequate engineering reviews. But she warned Robert that even if they won, the solution wouldn't be simple. You can't just demolish 75 houses where people are living, she explained. The court will look for a remedy that balances all the interests involved. You might get financial compensation. You might get the corrupt officials removed from office. But getting the land back exactly as it was, that's not going to happen. Robert knew she was right, but it still felt like failure. His grandmother's land was gone. The place where he'd learned to love nature, where he'd felt most at peace in the world, had been turned into just another suburban development. Even if he won in court, he'd already lost what mattered most. Then in late September, everything changed. A hurricane formed in the Atlantic and started heading toward the East Coast. Hurricane Elena wasn't supposed to be a major threat. The weather forecasters on TV talked about it in that calm, measured way they have when a storm isn't expected to be too serious. Category 1 winds, moderate rainfall, coastal flooding in some areas. The usual advice to secure outdoor furniture and stock up on bottled water. Robert was in Ohio when the storm started making headlines. He watched the weather reports with a knot of anxiety in his stomach that he couldn't quite explain. The storm was tracking toward Virginia, toward his grandmother's property, toward Meadowbrook Estates. He called Dr. Brooks, the environmental engineer who'd done the flood assessment. Should I be worried about this hurricane? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I'm watching the forecast closely. If Elena stalls out over land and drops sustained rainfall, you could see the exact scenario I warned about. How much rain are they predicting? 6 to 8 inches. That's manageable if it falls over several days and the ground can absorb it. But if it comes down fast or if the storm parks over the area... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Robert made a decision that might have seemed crazy. He called his principal and took emergency leave. Told his wife he needed to go to Virginia. She looked at him like he'd lost his mind. It's just a Category 1 hurricane, she said. You can't control the weather. What are you going to do down there? I don't know. But if something happens and I'm not there, I'll never forgive myself. He drove through the night, reaching Virginia as the first bands of rain started to fall. The highway was mostly empty. Most people were driving away from the storm, not toward it. Robert checked into a motel about 15 miles from Meadowbrook Estates and tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. By morning, the rain had intensified. Not the violent downpour you might expect from a hurricane, but steady, heavy rain that just kept coming. Hour after hour, the sky was the color of concrete. The wind gusted and swirled, but it wasn't the winds that worried Robert. It was the water. He drove past Meadowbrook Estates in the morning. The streets were already pooling with water. Not flooding yet, just large puddles forming at every low spot. Residents were moving cars to higher ground. Some were putting sandbags around garage doors. Most people looked concerned but not panicked. This was just a storm. They'd weathered storms before. Robert tried one more time to warn people. He stopped at a house where a man was outside securing his trash cans. You should consider evacuating, Robert said. This area has serious drainage problems. If the rain keeps up... I know who you are, the man interrupted. His face was hard and unfriendly. You're that guy who's trying to claim this whole neighborhood is illegal or whatever. We got emails from the HOA about you. You need to leave us alone. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm trying to tell you this area isn't safe in heavy rain. The engineering reports my house is fine. It passed inspection. I don't need you coming around here spreading fear. Robert drove away feeling helpless. He parked near the property and just watched. The rain continued. The Weather Service issued a flash flood watch, then a flash flood warning. The creek that ran through what used to be his grandmother's property was already rising, its brown water churning and fast. By afternoon, Hurricane Elena did something the forecasters hadn't predicted. It stalled. The storm just parked itself over central Virginia and sat there, spinning in place like a broken record. The rain that was supposed to taper off by evening instead intensified. Robert watched the creek transform from a stream into a river. The water rose inch by inch, then foot by foot. It started spilling over its banks. The concrete culverts that Pinnacle had installed were completely inadequate. Water backed up behind them, then found new paths, spreading across the landscape in sheets. The storm drains in Meadowbrook Estates started backing up around 6 in the evening. Robert could see water bubbling up from manholes. The streets became streams. Water flowed between the houses, finding every low spot and depression. The tight spacing between homes created channels that accelerated the flow. Robert called 911. There's going to be major flooding at Meadowbrook Estates. People need to evacuate now. The dispatcher sounded harried. Sir, we're receiving hundreds of calls. Emergency services are responding to the most critical situations first. Has anyone been injured? Not yet, but we'll send someone as soon as we can. If you're in a safe location, stay there. By 8 o'clock, the situation had gone from concerning to catastrophic. The creek jumped its banks completely and became a raging torrent 30 feet wide. Water surged through the development like a flash flood. Robert watched in horror as the water level in the streets rose from ankle deep to knee deep to waist deep. Lights started coming on in houses. People were realizing this wasn't just street flooding. Water was entering homes, first through garages and ground floor doors, then through windows, then rising higher and higher. Robert called 911 again. Meadowbrook Estates is flooding badly. People are trapped in their homes. You need to send rescue teams now. This time the dispatcher took him more seriously. How many structures are affected? All of them. There are 75 houses and most of them are flooding. The water's still rising. In the darkness and rain, Robert could hear people shouting. Car alarms were going off. The water kept coming. Some houses sat in what had been the natural low point of the property, and these flooded first and worst. In the house closest to where the creek used to run, the water reached the roofline. Robert could see someone in an upstairs window, waving frantically. Emergency services started arriving around 9 o'clock. Fire trucks, rescue boats, police cars with lights flashing. But they were overwhelmed. Dozens of families needed help simultaneously. The first responders had to prioritize the most dangerous situations. Houses where water was rising toward second floors. Families with small children or elderly residents. People trapped with no way out. Robert waded into the water. It was waist deep in places, the current strong enough to knock him off balance. He helped guide a rescue boat to a family stranded on their porch. Then another family. Then another. He worked alongside the firefighters and police officers, all of them soaked and exhausted. A young mother handed her baby to Robert through a second-floor window. Please, she sobbed. Get her out of here. Get her somewhere safe. Robert carried the baby to dry ground, sheltering her under his jacket from the rain. A paramedic took the child and wrapped her in a blanket. The mother was rescued minutes later, hysterical and shaking. The night was chaos. 75 families evacuated their homes carrying whatever they could grab. Photo albums, laptops, medications. One elderly man carried his cat. A teenage girl clutched a teddy bear. These were the fragments of lives interrupted by disaster. By midnight, everyone was out. No one had died, which was a miracle. But the community was destroyed. Standing on a slight rise, watching the floodwaters continue to surge through Meadowbrook Estates, Robert felt no satisfaction in being right. He'd tried to warn them, tried to stop this, but he'd failed. The Rodriguezes, the young couple with a baby who'd called Robert months ago, stood near the evacuation area, wrapped in Red Cross blankets. Mrs. Rodriguez saw Robert and started crying. Our house. Everything we own. It's all underwater. I'm so sorry, Robert said, and he meant it. These families were victims just like he was. Victims of Pinnacle's greed. Victims of corrupt officials who'd approved a dangerous development. Victims of a system that valued profit over safety. The rain finally stopped around 3 a.m. Hurricane Elena had dropped over 14 inches of rain in less than 20 hours. The floodwaters began to slowly recede, leaving behind a landscape of destruction. As dawn broke, Robert got his first clear look at the damage. It was worse than he'd imagined. 62 of the 75 houses had catastrophic flooding damage. Many were structurally compromised. Foundations had cracked under the pressure of the water. Walls had collapsed. Entire houses had shifted on their lots. The force of the flood had moved cars and scattered debris everywhere. The 13 houses that hadn't flooded directly were surrounded by destruction. Their property values had just plummeted to nothing. Who would want to buy a house in a neighborhood that had just been devastated by floods? News crews started arriving by mid-morning. Helicopters circled overhead, filming the devastation. Reporters interviewed sobbing families standing in front of their destroyed homes. The story was no longer about a legal dispute over stolen land. It was about a disaster, about families losing everything, about a development that never should have been built. One reporter recognized Robert from the earlier news stories. She approached him with a camera crew. "Mr. Patterson, you warned about flooding risks months ago. How do you feel now that this has happened?" Robert looked at the destruction, at the families sitting in shelters, at emergency workers still searching through debris. "I feel sick," he said honestly. "I tried to stop this. I tried to warn people. But nobody would listen, and now look what happened." The reporter pressed him. "Are you saying Pinnacle Development is responsible for this disaster?" "I'm saying they built houses in a floodplain. They destroyed natural drainage systems. They ignored environmental concerns. They cut corners and bribed officials to get permits they never saw." The days after the flood felt surreal. Meadowbrook Estates had become a disaster zone cordoned off with yellow caution tape. Inspectors from county, state, and federal agencies descended on the site. Engineers assessed structural damage. Environmental officials tested the water quality of the flooded creek. Insurance adjusters picked their way through the wreckage, cameras in hand, documenting everything. Robert stayed in Virginia. His principal had given him an additional week of leave, and his wife agreed he needed to see this through. He split his time between helping displaced families find temporary housing and meeting with investigators who suddenly wanted to hear everything he'd tried to tell people. For the past year, the state sent an investigator named Thomas Way, a senior official with the Department of Environmental Quality. He spent 3 days walking the property with Robert and Dr. Brooks, examining every aspect of the development. His face grew grimmer with each passing hour. "This is one of the worst cases of negligent development I've seen in 20 years, Way said. Every warning sign was ignored. Every regulation was bent or broken. This wasn't just unfortunate. This was predictable and preventable. The engineering reports that Pinnacle had submitted to get their permits were now under microscopic scrutiny. We found discrepancies everywhere. The soil studies had been incomplete. The flood risk assessment was based on outdated data. The drainage calculations assumed rainfall levels that hadn't reflected climate change patterns. Most damning, the engineer who'd signed off on everything had rubber-stamped the plans without conducting proper field analysis. "Did anyone actually walk this property before approving construction?" we asked. Robert shook his head. "If they had, they would have seen what I saw. What my grandmother knew. This land floods. Not every year, maybe not every decade, but when you get the right conditions, the water has to go somewhere. And now it had nowhere to go but through people's homes." The media attention intensified. National news outlets ran stories about Meadowbrook Estates. The narrative crystallized around several key elements. A grandmother's land stolen through fraud. A development company that cut corners. Corrupt officials who approved dangerous construction. And 75 families who lost everything when a storm exposed all the lies. Pinnacle Development tried to control the damage. Their CEO released a statement expressing sympathy for the affected families and promising a full investigation. The statement carefully avoided admitting any wrongdoing. They blamed the hurricane, blamed unprecedented rainfall, blamed climate change, blamed everything except their own decisions. But the evidence was mounting. Investigative journalists started digging into Pinnacle's history. They found a pattern. This wasn't the first development where corners had been cut. In Georgia, a Pinnacle subdivision had serious foundation issues. In Tennessee, another Pinnacle project had environmental violations. In North Carolina, they'd been sued for fraud by 3 different municipalities. The company operated in a gray area, exploiting loopholes in local regulations and betting they could move fast enough to avoid consequences. Usually it worked. By the time problems emerged, they'd sold the properties and moved on to the next project. But Hurricane Elena had exposed everything at once, and there was no moving on from a disaster this public. William Hutchins, the county board member who'd pushed through Pinnacle's permits, held a press conference. He looked pale and nervous as he read from a prepared statement. The county board followed all proper procedures in reviewing and approving the Meadowbrook Estates project. We relied on professional engineering reports and had no reason to question their validity. While we sympathize with the affected families, this was an act of nature that no one could have foreseen. A reporter shouted a question. "Mr. Hutchins, is it true your consulting company received $200,000 from Pinnacle's parent corporation?" Hutchins stammered. "That was for legitimate consulting services unrelated to this project. The timing was coincidental. What services did you provide?" "That information is proprietary and confidential." The press conference fell apart after that. Hutchins left without answering more questions. By evening, he'd announced his resignation from the county board, citing health reasons and family obligations. 2 other board members resigned within days. The local district attorney, facing intense public pressure, announced a criminal investigation into the approval process. The FBI field office in Richmond confirmed they were reviewing the case for potential federal violations. For the families living in temporary shelters and cheap motels, the investigations and resignations felt abstract and distant. Their immediate concern was survival. Where would they live? How would they pay their mortgages on uninhabitable houses? What happened to their belongings left to rot in flooded homes? The insurance situation became a nightmare. Most homeowners had standard policies that covered wind damage and some water damage, but not flooding caused by inadequate drainage and construction defects. The insurance companies started denying claims en masse, arguing that the damage resulted from negligent construction rather than the storm itself. Robert attended a community meeting at the local high school. About 50 families from Meadowbrook Estates crowded into the cafeteria, along with lawyers, insurance adjusters, and county officials. The mood was angry and desperate. A father of 3 stood up, his voice shaking. "My insurance company says they won't pay because the house was built wrong. But I didn't build it wrong. I bought what I thought was a safe home for my family. How is this my fault?" A lawyer explained that they were exploring a class action lawsuit against Pinnacle Development. "We believe we can demonstrate gross negligence and fraud. The challenge is that Pinnacle is already preparing to file for bankruptcy protection, which will complicate everything." "What does that mean?" a woman asked. "We just lose everything and they walk away?" "Not necessarily, but it means this will be a long legal process and recovery may be limited." Robert stood up. Everyone in the room knew who he was now. Some still saw him as the troublemaker, who'd tried to stop their neighborhood. Others had come to understand he'd been trying to protect them. "I want you all to know I'm not backing down," he said. "I'm adding my voice to your lawsuit. We're going after Pinnacle, the engineers who signed off on this and the county officials who approved it. They destroyed my family's land and they destroyed your homes. They need to be held accountable." A few people applauded. Others just looked tired and broken. Mrs. Rodriguez approached Robert after the meeting. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you," she said quietly. "When you tried to warn us, I thought you were just angry about losing your land. I didn't understand you were trying to help." "You had no reason to believe me," Robert said. "You trusted the system. We all want to believe the system works, that someone's checking to make sure things are safe. But sometimes it fails." Over the next several weeks, the full scope of the failure became clear. The county's building inspection department had been understaffed and overwhelmed. Inspectors had approved work without thorough review. Warning signs had been missed or ignored. The system hadn't just failed at one point. It had failed at multiple levels repeatedly, over many months. 3 executives from Pinnacle Development were arrested and charged with fraud related to the forged sale documents for Robert's grandmother's land. The charges included conspiracy, forgery, and grand larceny. Their lawyers immediately began negotiating plea deals. The county engineer who'd overseen the permit approval process was placed on administrative leave. The engineering firm that had signed off on Pinnacle's plans lost their license to operate in Virginia pending a review by the state board, but none of these consequences helped the families living in temporary housing. They needed immediate relief, not just eventual justice. The Federal Emergency Management Agency declared the area a disaster zone, which unlocked some funding for temporary assistance. The Red Cross and other charities provided support. Local churches opened their doors, but these were band-aids on a catastrophic wound. Robert walked through Meadowbrook Estates in early October. Most of the houses stood empty now, condemned by building inspectors. The flood damage was visible everywhere. Water lines stained the walls at chest height or higher. Mold was growing. The smell was horrible, a mix of mud and rot and chemicals. He stood where his grandmother's farmhouse used to be. Under one of these destroyed houses, he thought. Buried and forgotten, the old white house where he'd learned to make pancakes, where he'd played board games on rainy days, where his grandmother had taught him to play chess. All of it was gone, paved over by greed and corruption. But something Dr. Brooks had said stuck with him. The land remembers, she'd told him. You can build on a floodplain, but the water will always come back eventually. Nature doesn't care about property lines or development plans. It follows the path it's followed for thousands of years. Hurricane Elena had proven that. The water had flowed exactly where the land wanted it to flow, where it had always flowed before bulldozers and houses got in the way. In a strange sense, the storm had spoken for the land itself, rejecting what had been forced upon it. Robert knew the legal battles ahead would be long and exhausting. The criminal trials, the civil lawsuits, the bankruptcy proc. The criminal trial of Pinnacle Development's executives began on a cold January morning. Robert sat in the courtroom gallery, watching as 3 men in expensive suits were led to the defense table. These were the people who'd forged his grandmother's signature, who'd stolen her land, who'd built a disaster waiting to happen and called it Meadowbrook Estates. The prosecution's case was strong. They had the forged documents. They had medical records proving Robert's grandmother couldn't have signed anything in her condition. They had testimony from hospital staff. They had financial records showing suspicious payments to county officials. The evidence was overwhelming, but the defense lawyers were skilled. They argued their clients had relied on subordinates who'd assured them everything was legitimate. They painted a picture of busy executives who'd been deceived by lower-level employees. They claimed any irregularities were the result of miscommunication, not criminal intent. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Robert attended every day he could, missing more work and adding more stress to his already strained marriage. But he needed to see this through, needed to look these men in the eyes and have them see him, the grandson whose inheritance they'd stolen, the person they'd dismissed as an inconvenient obstacle. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was mixed. 2 executives were found guilty on multiple counts. The third was convicted only of minor charges. The sentencing wouldn't come for months, but the convictions felt like a victory. Not a complete victory, but something. The civil lawsuit was more complicated. Robert and the 75 families from Meadowbrook Estates had joined together in a class action suit against Pinnacle Development, the engineering firm, and several county officials. They were seeking hundreds of millions in damages for fraud, negligence, and emotional distress. But Pinnacle had already filed for bankruptcy protection. Their assets were being liquidated, and there were many creditors in line ahead of the homeowners. The engineering firm's insurance company was fighting the claims. The county officials argued they had governmental immunity for decisions made in their official capacity. Patricia, Robert's lawyer, explained the harsh reality. We'll win eventually. The question is how much we can actually collect. Bankruptcy proceedings can take years. Insurance companies will fight every claim. This could drag on for a decade. Robert felt exhausted just thinking about it. What happens to the families in the meantime? They survive however they can. Some will walk away from their mortgages. Some will file personal bankruptcy. Some will rebuild their lives in other places. It's not fair, but it's reality. The insurance situation became a patchwork of different outcomes. Some companies paid partial claims. Others denied everything and forced families to sue. A few families had better coverage and received enough to start over. Most got little or nothing. The Rodriguezes were among those who lost everything. Their insurance paid only 10% of their losses, not enough to cover their mortgage balance or replace what they'd lost. They ended up filing for bankruptcy and moving in with Mrs. Rodriguez's parents in another state. Their dreams of home ownership were shattered, their credit ruined, their savings gone. Robert tried to help where he could. He'd started a fundraiser that raised about $50,000, which he distributed to the families in the worst situations. It wasn't nearly enough, but it helped some people make rent for a few months or buy basic necessities. By spring, Meadowbrook Estates looked like a ghost town. Most houses stood empty and decaying. A few families had tried to salvage their homes, gutting them to the studs and starting expensive rebuilds, but most people had just walked away. The houses sat like tombstones marking the death of the American dream. The county was stuck with a massive problem. They owned some of the properties now through tax foreclosure. The others were in legal limbo, owned by banks who'd foreclosed on mortgages or by insurance companies who'd paid claims. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for the cleanup and demolition. Environmental concerns added another layer of complexity. The flooding had spread contamination from damaged houses. Mold was everywhere. Chemicals from cleaning products, paints, and building materials had leached into the soil. The creek was polluted. The whole site was becoming an environmental hazard. The EPA got involved and declared Meadowbrook Estates a brownfield site requiring remediation. That meant federal oversight and strict regulations about what could be done with the property. It also meant potential federal funding for cleanup, but the process would be slow and bureaucratic. Robert met with county officials to discuss the future of the land. His legal claim to ownership was now undisputed. The criminal convictions had validated his case, but owning 75 destroyed houses and contaminated land wasn't the victory he'd imagined. "What do you want to do with it?" a county administrator asked him. Robert had been thinking about that question for months. "I want it gone, all of it. Every house demolished. The land restored as close as possible to what it was. And then I want to make sure this can never happen again." The demolition took 6 months and cost nearly $2 million. Federal disaster funds covered some of it. The county contributed. Environmental remediation grants helped. Robert used what was left of the class action settlement that finally came through. It wasn't enough to make anyone whole, but it was something. Robert was there the day the first house came down. He watched the excavator tear into the walls, reducing someone's former dream home to rubble in less than an hour. It felt both sad and necessary, like amputating a diseased limb to save the body. House by house, Meadowbrook Estates disappeared. The debris was sorted. Recyclable materials were separated out. Contaminated materials were properly disposed of. The concrete foundations were broken up and hauled away. It was slow, expensive work, but it was progress. As the houses came down, the land began to re-emerge. You could see the original contours again, the natural drainage patterns, the path the creek wanted to follow. Robert worked with Dr. Brooks and a team of environmental restoration specialists to develop a plan for returning the land to something close to its original state. They replanted native trees and grasses. They removed the concrete culverts and let the creek find its natural channel again. They created wetland areas that would absorb floodwater naturally. They removed invasive species and reintroduced native plants. It was painstaking work that would take years to fully mature, but Robert could see progress. His grandmother's farmhouse was gone forever, buried somewhere under the soil they were now restoring. But the land itself could heal. Nature was resilient if you gave it a chance. Robert established a conservation easement on the entire property. It was a legal designation that meant the land could never be developed again. No houses, no commercial buildings. The land would remain open space in perpetuity, protected for future generations. He donated the easement to a land trust that would enforce the restrictions forever. The legal resolution took 3 more years. The criminal appeals were exhausted. The civil lawsuit was finally settled. 5 county officials were permanently barred from holding public office. The engineering firm was dissolved. Pinnacle Development ceased to exist. The financial settlement was less than the families deserved, but it was something. Most people received enough to partially offset their losses. It didn't make them whole, but it acknowledged the harm done to them. Some families used the money to buy new homes elsewhere. Others paid off debts, A few donated their shares to charity, too bitter to keep money that came from such a painful experience. Robert never fully recovered financially. The legal fees had depleted his savings. He'd borrowed heavily and would be paying off loans for years. His marriage had survived but was strained. His kids were teenagers now, and had grown up with a father who was often absent, fighting a battle that consumed his life for 5 years. But on a warm Saturday in May, Robert stood on the land that had been his grandmother's and was now healing. The grass was green, wildflowers were blooming, the creek ran clear again, following its ancient path. Birds were returning. Deer had been spotted. The land was remembering what it used to be. Patricia came to visit him that day. She walked the property with Robert, marveling at the transformation. "You did it," she said. "It took longer than it should have, cost more than it should have, and the victory isn't as complete as it should be." "But you did it." Robert shook his head. "The families from Meadowbrook Estates are the ones who paid the real price. Mrs. Rodriguez and her family. The elderly couple who lost their retirement savings. The young guy who was just starting his career. They're the real victims here. You're all victims, but you're also survivors, and you've created something important here. This land is protected now. Your grandmother's legacy is preserved in a different way than you expected, but it's preserved." Robert thought about that. His grandmother had wanted him to have the land so he'd always have a connection to his roots, a place that meant something beyond money or development. In the end, even though everything had gone wrong, maybe he'd honored that wish. The land was safe. It would remain wild and natural. Future generations could walk here and see what rural Virginia looked like before everything was paved over. A family walked past on the public trail that